All right.
I'm Kelly Sullivan. I'm a clinical associate professor of Irish literature and Irish studies at Gloucester Ireland House here at NYU.
And I'm Garry Hynes, and I'm artistic director of Druid.
Well, Garry, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with me. And I wanted to start by congratulating you on being named Best Director at the UK Theatre Awards. It was just a couple of days ago. And also congratulations on the trilogy, which is phenomenal and has had like all 5-star reviews everywhere.
Thank you.
So it's very well deserved. I wanted to kind of step back and ask you about, you've done a number of these like Druid Sing, Druid Murphy, Druid Shakespeare. How did you have the like mad idea to start these, take on doing multiple plays in one day in this format?
I think that possibly it started with Martin McDonagh's work, funnily enough, in the sense that we premiered The Beauty Queen of Linan back in the 90s, played on Broadway for about a year. And we had in fact optioned 2 more of Martin's plays. But as I thought of ways to produce it, it became The Curse of the Second Play. And because Beauty Queen was such an extraordinary success. And I thought then, given that the other 2 plays existed, that if we did the 3 plays together, not the second play, but 3 plays, Beauty Queen and the other 2 together, and called it the Linan Trilogy, that would be a good second production. And that's got me thinking then of, if you like, longer form theatre, which is the word I use for want of anything better. I'd always been, the Play by the Western World was the first production I directed for Druid, and Sing has always been simply, for me, the greatest writer for the theatre. And I had thought for quite some time that I would love at some time to do all the plays together, but I thought that the only way I could do that was to leave Druid, and found a Sing company for a period of 2 or 3 years. And then gradually around this time I began to think, well, why do I have to leave Druid? It seems now very obvious, but it didn't to me at the time. Why doesn't Druid do the 6 Sing plays? And that's what we did. And I think as a company we found it a very satisfying way to work. Our audiences loved it, and very quickly we began to think of other possible long-form events like this.
Okay.
And for want of a better name, that first Sing was called Druid Sing. And one of the things that I remember very specifically is talking to Tom Murphy and saying, Tom, I'd love to do this with 3 of your plays. And he said, yes, I'd love that to happen, but there's one thing, Garry, that can't happen. And I said, what is that? And he said, it cannot certainly be called Druid Murphy. I said, of course not, that would be just dreadful. Guess what it ended up being called?
It's branding now. So Druid is based in Galway.
Yeah.
And Sing, plays set in the west of Ireland.
Yeah.
Murphy, playwright I very much associate with Galway and the west of Ireland,
Yeah.
although of course, also Dublin based.
Yeah.
Well, Shakespeare, different category altogether.
Category altogether, yeah.
Martin McDonagh, also kind of a west of Ireland, imagine west of Ireland, all of them,
Yes.
I suppose. And then we get O'Casey. So what brought you to producing O'Casey, and why, why did you take on O'Casey?
Quite simply, first of all, I had directed 2 productions of O'Casey. Once, The Plan of the Stars for the Abbey in the early 90s when I was artistic director there, and then Juno the Paycock in a commercial production in Dublin produced by Noel Pearson. Immediately on producing Druid Sing, to me, and to probably everybody else, the obvious next writer was O'Casey, because these plays were much more of a trilogy and much more, made sense than, say, the Sing or the Murphy. It was to be the second project, but we had difficulty acquiring the rights.
Okay.
To the extent that we couldn't do them, and really the project passed us by. I personally thought at that point then that it was a shame, but that it wasn't going to happen. And then gradually, over 4 or 5 years ago, it became clear that we could acquire the rights at this point. Finally I made a decision, yes, let's do it.
There's almost something felicitous about that with the decade of centenaries and kind of the timing of the whole thing. I was wondering if that was partially intentional.
Everybody, like when it was originally supposed due to produce it, it might have ran in 2016, and both at that time and this time, everybody thought they were commemorative events,
Right.
but they absolutely weren't, and I wished that it hadn't, because everybody asked that question.
Okay, yeah, interesting. Although, I mean, they're almost, well, one of the remarkable things about the plays is that they were written so shortly after the events that happened. It's like, it's amazing.
Yeah.
So in a way, they're almost commenting on the decade of centenaries.
Absolutely.
They're almost not commemorative, but kind of critical.
Absolutely.
In a sense.
Yeah, as theatre always should be. I mean, it should always be. Theatre exists in 2 time zones. The time it was written, 3 really. The time it was written, the time it's about, and the time it's being performed. So, that very much, we felt that very much with the O'Casey.
Yeah. I want to come back to the question for sure of like the contemporary moment with these plays, but I'm going to save that for a bit later.
Okay.
But I'm really, it's interesting that you've produced them before, directed 2 of them before. How is that challenging to come back to a play and do it again, or is it sort of a new experience each time?
I think it's a new experience each time, in any case, and if it isn't, really you shouldn't be doing them. But in the case, the O'Casey was like in the early 90s, a long time ago, and also the production was sort of overwhelmed by controversies that were less, I think, to do with the play and more to do with the fact that I chose it and produced it as my first production as artistic director of the Abbey. There was a political context with the small p, which was less to do with the play. And I suppose, in thinking about it, I wanted the peace and quiet to do the play without all that noise. And the same in the case of Juno.
Okay. They're also, this production of them seems really different as well, even though they're the same script, same plays, but they feel revitalized, I suppose, from productions I've seen of them in the past. I'm sure that was a conscious thing and a subconscious thing, but what do you have strategies for kind of, I don't know, reimagining a play, or is it an organic process that comes about based on who's acting and where you're performing and so on?
Well, I think who's acting and where you're performing and when you're performing, all those kind of things definitely will affect, how you eventually, what form they eventually find. Yeah. But there's no question that in terms of O'Casey, I felt very strongly about the performative aspect of his writing, rather than a kind of a sort of naturalism that he is often regarded as. So that was behind a decision, for instance, to not use the Georgian architecture, which actually came about with me simply for weeks and weeks searching the internet for visual records of previous productions.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just becoming eventually so fed up of all those Georgian images.
Fanlights.
You know, yes. And eventually, through discussion with Francis, we agreed that whatever we were going to do, we're not going to use that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and then I was very pleased. I was afraid of the decision we'd taken,
Mm-hmm.
but I was also very pleased with it because it seemed that it gave a kind of background from which the actors could jump forward, rather than sort of almost wrapping them in this kind of Georgian wrapping paper.
Yeah, there was one element I noticed, and I brought a group of master's students to see the Plow on the Stars, and several of them commented in discussion later that the actors, I mean, we're talking about Georgian tenements where lots of people lived in like the same room potentially.
Yeah.
And deep poverty in a lot of cases as well. And the plays on the page, nobody has any privacy. It's one of the major themes of the plays is that everyone's always in everyone else's business, and part of the comedy of it too. But actually on the stage, the actors kind of own the spaces in a way that's really brings an energy to it.
Yeah.
So one of my questions was like, how intentional was that, or how much was that, in response to the way that you visualize the stage, I suppose, and the way that the elements move around on the stage, between the plays, that is, or between the acts.
Yeah, I would say, like for instance, I think it always happens. I mean, the thing with the plays is that they're big plays and they're usually played in big proscenium arch auditoria. And you can look at a lot of productions and say, if I could have lived in that room, like in which the Pegard takes place, I'd be very happy. And
I think I lived in one of those in 2002, and it cost me like €1,200.
Exactly, how lucky you were.
Yeah.
And so that is a problem associated with it. So obviously, the fact that it created a lot of space was something then that I knew there was no real way, and Francis and I talked about it, to escape that.
Yeah.
And as a result, it was a matter of embracing it.
Mm-hmm.
And like, for me, like something like the bar, I mean, there was talk in the rehearsal room when, we started, say, the rehearsals in the bar first, and said, well, this bar definitely isn't doing very well, given its size and the few people that are in it. But it seemed to me to feel truer to the fact that these are plays. I think that's the critical thing. And so, when we did, like for practical reasons, when we decided to use flattage and to use the language of flattage, like the stage weights and so on, that felt to me something I could own. And it just felt right as a space, and it felt kind of honest to what I knew to be Sean's experience, that he went to the music hall, that he loved Rusico. It just made sense.
Yeah, Rusico with the sort of such melodrama, and the theater is such a spectacle.
That's right.
Yeah. That makes me think of the scene changes in Plow on the Stars, where it's actually the actors who are doing a lot of the moving of things too. So it's like it ties into the theme of labor as well. It seems in an important way.
I hadn't even thought of that.
Yeah, well, they're actually working. I noticed how empty the bar was, but it also made me realize that as we do in New York City, you go to a public space because that's where space is, right? You don't have that space necessarily in your flat or in your tenement. So you go in part to get away, and then of course everyone follows you there. But so the openness of the bar in a way felt kind of true because of that too. O'Casey was so specific about some of the details in the plays. How did you handle that? I was reading the stage notes for Plow on the Stars, and he asks for the picture of the Gleaners to be on the wall in
Right,
LA,
yeah,
and
yeah.
I was like, wait, was that there? I can't remember, and I even went back and watched some of the trailers, and I was like, I don't think it was there. But
Not
I'm
only
sure.
was the Gleaners there,
It was there.
the Gleaners was there, but the Angelus was there as well.
Was it? They're both there?
Yeah.
So you did, so yeah, so he's so specific, and everything has a kind of resonance to it, because those are such like
Yeah,
workers,
I mean, yeah,
socialist paintings.
I grew up with the Gleaners on,
Yeah.
you know, in my own family home and in other houses I went into. So I think for me always as well, it's the dynamic of the space.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you're going to do naturalistic realism, my experience as a director is that you're going to get locked down by it.
Mm-hmm.
Because eventually you, all the actors and all the audiences know that there's a missing wall from the four walls.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, that there's people at one end of it and people at the other end of it.
Yeah.
And there's something about not acknowledging that in anything, for me, that doesn't feel honest.
Mm-hmm. And you even really acknowledge it from the very beginning with the knock on the wall.
That's right.
And the wall kind of
Yeah.
disappears then,
Yeah.
to let us in.
Yeah, but yeah, we were very, I mean, we talked a lot about France, and I talked a lot about the fact that knocking
Mm-hmm.
was so pervasive
Yeah,
throughout
I
the
wrote
three
knocking
plays.
down. There's knocking everywhere.
Yeah,
Yeah, but it's both a like let us into this world, but also an invasion of privacy over and over and over again,
Yeah.
or a threat, or potentially something great coming to your door. You never know.
oh, absolutely. I mean, you know, it is extraordinary. I mean, Aaron and Rory, the two actors playing in both Juno and Plow on the Stars, for me, they had this idea before we started rehearsal, and for the moment, when it comes off, that the play, the Plow on the Stars opens with him fixing the lock,
Mm-hmm.
and that when he comes in then as Jock Surrey comes
Yeah.
through the door and it comes off in his hand. For me, I love that moment.
Yeah. What that was something that I wish I'd been able to see all three plays before this conversation. But
Yeah.
I'm wondering how many through lines there are like that, because there's so many. I mean, all of the plays kind of take place in not the same space, and you're very careful to distinguish the spaces, but in the same world and the same kind of time period. Same short 7 years or whatever it is. So. Are there other little through lines like that?
Well, you know what? There's less than I would have thought before I started rehearsals. We played around a lot about one particular thing that I was almost sure was going to emerge, was that we were going to see the characters from one play as crowds or in passing or haunting in the other plays, but that just did not happen. It just never emerged as something that was interesting or whatever. But even like when we perform in New York or certainly outside of Ireland, there's obviously always the issue of being understood, and like the cast were acknowledging over the last few days that it's great on trilogy days, because you can hear the audience tuning in much more over 3 plays than you would over a single play. So
yeah, that would be a difficult one for moving the play, right? I mean, depending on where you are, I wonder how much a play changes anyway, but particularly for audiences who have to kind of be trained on something, have to learn.
Yeah, and yes, absolutely, and then again, the thing is that, despite the fact that there's no Georgian skin on the plays, we sort of obeyed his ground plan. And I looked at ground plans, and there's a great story about, I think maybe Samuel French asking him to write stage directions for possibly a publication of all three plays, and himself and Eileen writing them together, and I'm sure probably getting paid for writing them. So I'd love to follow that up sometime. I haven't had time to do it.
The actual physical set,
Yeah.
it's all the same for all three plays, but it
Yes.
moves around, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Did that come from Ireland with you, or do you rebuild it here?
No, we had to build.
Question, I guess, but
We had to build two sets.
Okay.
So we were building two sets in order to ship this one
Yeah.
out, because the performance dates in Ireland were too close to performance
okay.
dates here
Okay.
to be able to use both,
Yeah.
which didn't go down well with the financial controllers of the company.
On the subject of staging itself, I also wanted to ask about the costumes, because
Yeah.
I understand that certain parts of the costumes maybe get recycled in other plays as well. There's
Yeah.
a certain kind of continuity there, and this
Yeah.
idea that things get sold and passed down and bartered and maybe looted and so on. How much research goes into that kind of aspect of these plays? Like, did you look at a lot of photographs and kind of pick and choose and then alter to fit what your vision of the play was?
No, I wouldn't necessarily, in most cases I wouldn't necessarily be imagining a specific, I wouldn't be going around carrying certain costume images in my mind. It's more, as I said, the dynamic of the space that concerns me. But I do know that the costume designers, Francis O'Connor and Cleena, did. I mean, the amount of research, information, and photographs and drawings and everything that was pinned on the walls of the rehearsal room was huge. And I personally, I'm really happy with the fact that I think they don't look like they're held down by period, but they are quite period. You could argue against some of them, but you couldn't really. They follow, and they clearly are designs by people who know what people were wearing then, even though it wouldn't look like that if you suddenly fetched up in Parnell Square in 1916.
Yeah, that seems to fit with a kind of pushback against the overly naturalistic, realist interpretation of the plays, which also seems to have the effect of freeing the characters from a purely naturalistic kind of reading of them or interpretation of them too.
Yeah.
Because these would be, these kind of can be deeply depressing plays, but they can also be uplifting plays or plays that are like energizing in their politics. So if you read the characters as trapped in their circumstances, they're pretty bleak. But
absolutely. But he's terribly funny.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of thinking that we've been talking about was about that, was like letting the sort of antic spirit of O'Casey out.
Yeah.
Because sometimes there's a terrible sort of Holy Mary approach about them. And I would probably be guilty of that myself as well. And it just felt like, so for instance, there's one of the photographs I think that captures it very well is a photograph of Aaron as Fluther at the end of the second act when he's drunk with the jar, and he's like a sprite, or he's like, it's like an image out of Boucicault or a Boucicault character, and that feeds to me what I see in the plays.
Yeah, I could see that for sure. I wanted to ask about, one other question about staging. I'm really interested in the staging aspects. The loudspeaker as Pierce instead of the figure in the window.
Yeah.
So I think it's a brilliant choice because it sort of disembodies the voice and makes it pure rhetoric almost. Was there a conversation around that when you were making that decision? How did that kind of
again, you know, I mean, I'm realising on my answers, I'm sounding like everything was done from a negative set of reasons, but I just think that scene, that small scene, is a pain in the ass. And how to stage those two guys outside, then you have to have a window, then you have to have a street, then you have, and I just think, you know, it never worked for me anytime I've seen it, and never worked for me. And I thought the only way you could even begin to make this work is if you wanted to spend a whole lot of money on a very sort of detailed. So I said, well, let's scrap it all together. Why do we need to see them? And then the idea of the speaker, and I think it feels really right, because you're not then very early in the play distracted of what the hell is going on way back up there.
Right.
So I really probably thought of it as a way of escaping from the demands of having to stage the scene.
Well, it works. It works that way. And I mean, to me, it makes it all the more terrifying, right? I mean, if it's somebody outside the window, it's sort of powerful, but you just think of a speaker on a soapbox kind of orating a crowd of people around. But when it's like this loudspeaker piping into your, you know, it's a bit of, you know, Big Brother, and it's a little bit
exactly.
of, it's all more kind of
Orwell.
eerie. Yeah, exactly. There's so many contemporary resonances with these plays, and I'm kind of even afraid to delve into some of them, but I wanted to ask, I guess, if, you know, I mean, theater's political, and you've certainly said as much in other interviews, and I won't quote you back to yourself, but people are on a stage and they're you know, making something in the moment, and you said earlier that there's kind of the 3 times of a play, when it's written, when it's set, and when it's being performed. Has that changed at all in bringing the plays to the United States? Do the plays feel different to you here, or do they have a different kind of resonance here?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
And I don't, you know, that wouldn't be my experience of bringing the play, bringing any play here, that they feel particularly different. Obviously, the American audience, you know, miss certain nuance and detail that an Irish audience will naturally get, particularly an Irish theatre-going audience who, you know, I don't know what the percentage is, but a significant percentage of an audience at these plays would have seen at least one of them before in other productions. So, no, it doesn't feel particularly...
It doesn't change, yeah.
No.
I'm very interested in kind of urban, Dublin in particular, but urban Ireland in this time period, and there's so much change, you know, happening. But I'm pretty sure by 1911, wasn't Dublin like the poorest, or had the worst tenement conditions in, maybe in all of Europe, but certainly in the United Kingdom at the time. And not least of all, you know, issues with tuberculosis and health problems, and we see that come up in the plays too. But it's striking that you know, your production of the plays don't show, obviously people are poor and laboring, they're working, but we see kind of different strata within the tenement. We see people they have possessions that enrich their lives, and they have rich inner lives. But I kept thinking of, you know, just city life generally, and you know, issues with housing, issues with strikes and workers' strikes, which come up in the plays. And I guess this question of labor kept coming up a lot in The Pawn of the Stars. And it's a play that's very much concerned about labor. Even to the costumes, there's so many uniforms in the play.
Absolutely.
From military uniforms to overalls, and people are stripping them off to have kind of their evening clothes, but everything's kind of a uniform. So I don't know, this isn't really a question, I'm just observing how connected the plays feel to the contemporary moment too.
Well, it's kind of interesting that you make that comment, because like Druid's reputation, because of its founding in Galway, and because of the fact that it's was the first professional theatre to be founded outside Dublin, is as a non-Dublin company, i.e. therefore a non-urban company. And therefore, because we also happened then to choose Sing as a kind of almost house writer and so on. So, you know, for Druid to be doing the urban plays would be regarded as, oh, you know, they're you know, they're not stone walls and fields. Suddenly was changed, and I believe there's an Irish word that's used to describe people from the country rather than the city, and it's culture. So I believe that within the business people were calling the cycle the DruidO'Casey, which I've no problem with actually. But it was good.
Just the news the last couple of days and the last week with questions of, well, the news the last 5 years or more with questions of nationalism and kind of an inward turn of nations, and then disputes over, you know, borders and land in different ways seems to have a real resonance with this play. And O'Casey's so clear that any ideology is kind of a bad ideology. I wonder what you take from O'Casey in terms of, you know, politics, but politics is kind of not the word I want. I guess just sort of an attitude to one's historic moment. How do individuals make their way, I guess? What can we learn from these plays?
Well, I think, first of all, that he chose, and it'll be so brilliant to be able to sit down and talk to him about this, but that he chose to write these plays against the background of major events, the three sort of major events at the foundation of the Irish state. And very quickly in the rehearsal room, because, you know, making the decision to produce the plays and doing them together, and, you know, you are quite properly and quite naturally always doubting yourself. And, you know, it gradually emerges in the rehearsal room, oh, my fear about that was unfounded, but my fear of that is very founded, that's not working. And one of the things that I've heard very quickly was how, within weeks of beginning to rehearse all three plays, of how brilliantly he uses the nature of the political events, like how different plays are in relation to 1916, the Civil War. And I think it's possibly an achievement that's so singular, and it's not rarely commented on, but it's an incredible achievement that he manages to create pieces of dramatic fiction using the real history of events and managing to do that without distracting from either, without distracting from the history or distracting from what he wants to say himself. And I think, to me, what's just spectacular is that the plays were written so close to the events, and how lucky, how extraordinarily lucky and visionary were the Abbey to produce all three plays over 6 years. And I think one of the sad things about that from my point of view is that they did do them, they obviously did them well in the sense that one looks at the reaction to them, and that then the man who wrote them and the theatre who was wise enough and good enough to produce them fell out. And that to me is one of the really sad theatre stories, because I think, you know, I've read, and I think it's probably true, that it's exaggerated the nature of the falling out and so on and so forth. But the reality is that when he was writing those plays, he was writing for a place that he knew, for actors that he knew, which I think was incredibly important.
Oh, interesting.
And when he left Ireland, for whatever reasons he did leave Ireland, that can't be disputed. But I think he was let down, and I think the Irish theatre missed out as well.
It's almost as if in the moment the Abbey knew the plays were great, they responded to these immediate events.
And it was quite brave to respond to those immediate
absolutely.
events, because
There's
you know,
fresh politics.
Yes, exactly.
Still going on.
Exactly.
And then it almost took 100 years, I mean, not 100 years, but, maybe 100 years to realize just how prescient the plays really were, and how much, how right they were in their ambivalence and so on. Not that they weren't popular for that whole length of time, but we can really see now how prescient they were and how important they were.
Well, absolutely, and the fact that we have those plays allows the real stories of what went on.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that the people who went out in 1916 died, and that I've heard it said, seen it written, that the best people died, and that by the time it came to the Civil War, there was an entrenchment of conservative values, and that very much affected the nature of the state that was founded and that we lived in. And I lived in, the conservative, the rule of the church, all of those kind of things were very much, the nature of the state that emerged was very much affected by that fact.
Yeah, absolutely. Which makes me think actually of one element in The Plough and the Stars that didn't come clear on the page, but in your production was very evident, which was the strength of O'Casey's women characters. And it was something, I mean, they're strong characters on the page, but not really. Your production, I think, highlights that somehow. Was that intentional, or was that just sort of how it happened? It was just organic?
No, I mean, I would always have thought, well, the female characters are great. I mean, Juno, so clearly the heroine hero of her play. But the other thing that I became conscious of, that I mightn't have been so conscious of before, was the three young women. I thought, these are the three women who are going to inherit the state that was made. Those girls, chronologically, wouldn't, if they lived full lives, wouldn't have started dying till the 1950s, the 1960s. So they were the people who were going to inherit. And that suddenly felt like something very conscious that he had written.
Yeah, absolutely. What was the hardest thing about producing these plays? And I mean specific to O'Casey. What's the hardest thing about producing an O'Casey play?
Well, I mean, the language is difficult.
The language, okay.
I mean, you do have to, like you as a director and people around you and the actors, you can't run scared from the fact of the convolution, the poetry. You have to get in underneath that, because if you don't own that, then the plays are just not going to come alive. And I would think that would be something everybody would echo. I think then, whenever you do great plays that have a reputation as being great, plays that, they've been produced so frequently, you're in the rehearsal room and you're thinking, oh my God, people are going to say, you know, they're going to be bored, or they're going to say, "Oh, I've seen this before," or "I don't want to buy a ticket to this." You know, you've all the usual concerns.
Yeah. The language is so, you know, imaginative, and so that's where all the life is in the place,
Yes.
of course. Which seems to link to a lot of the other playwrights the Druid kind of focuses on. I mean, Tom Murphy for sure, but
Yeah.
McDonough, and then Singh, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, sort of the originator in some ways of that. Not, he is one of the founding fathers
Yes.
of that kind of energy
Yes.
through language,
Yes.
which is so exciting
Yeah.
when it's done well.
Well, for me, it always is the language. The language is so central, and as well as that, I mean, we were lucky as a company, and I was lucky as a director to, if you like, be apprenticed to a very hard taskmaster, which is Tom Murphy, and you know, I started working with him in the late 80s, and he said, if I have written 3 dots between these 2 words, it is different than if I have written 2 dots. And if you don't obey that, I would chop your head off. So I obeyed it.
A little bit more liberty with the playwright who isn't here to
Well,
tell you
no,
about-
but you know, one knows enough about him to say,
Yeah.
if he wasn't happy, you'd know about it.
You'd sense it.
Yeah.
Well, one last question, which may be an unfair question, but what's next for Druid? Is there something else? Is there another trilogy lined up?
No, not for the moment. I mean, certainly, I mean, this it was a big ask. They're a big set of players, a big cast, and you know, a lot of people could say it's too ambitious, or you know, so on. So, and also the fact that happens right across, from the actors to the crews, the producers, everybody in the organisation. It's big, and I think we'll you know, we're hopefully going to tour Ireland with one of these productions, and I would be very happy to think that the last performance of the trilogy this year in Ann Arbor won't be the last performance ever of the trilogy. So I think we just leave that to settle for a while.
Take a holiday?
No, you just have to keep going.
Keep going.
Yeah.
All right, well, thanks so much. It was fun to talk, and congratulations again.
Thank you. Thank you for such interesting questions.